On. Hello, Bruce. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Lian. I'm delighted to be talking to you today.
Oh, I am thrilled. As I was saying to you, and I can't really understand why, perhaps we were just waiting for you to come on the show, but we've never spoken about this topic before. And it seems such a beautiful fit for the show. I think there's so much can be revealed in near-death experiences. So I'm like, why have we never talked about this before? But I think we were just waiting for you to come along.
Great. I agree. I think it is very, very relevant to your show.
I'm really so looking forward to this. When I realized we were going to talk today, all day I've been thinking, oh, I can't wait. So before we start to really dive into the topic itself, I would love to know, I mean, it's not exactly an average line of work. In fact, I was just imagining if people say, what do? You trying to explain that. What on earth led you into this? What gave you this passion?
Well, I came to the topic sort of unwillingly. I was raised in a scientific household in the United States, a very materialistic household. My father was a chemist. And I went through college and medical school with that mindset that the physical world is all there is, and anything that's not physical is not real. And I entered then my psychiatric training after medical school, thinking that the mind is just what the brain does, and that's all there is to it. And in the first weeks of my training, I was confronted by a patient who was brought into the emergency room after an overdose. And I was supposed to evaluate her that evening. And she was unconscious. I could not talk to her, could not arouse her, but her roommate had brought her in, and I went down to the hall to talk to her roommate in a different room. I got information about the patient from the roommate and then sent the roommate home, and then went back to talk to the patient again, and she was still unconscious. So she was admitted to the intensive care unit overnight, and I saw her the next morning when she was awakened, and she was still very groggy. And I said to her at that point, "Good morning, I'm Dr. Greyson." And she opened one eye and said, "I know who you are. I remember you from last night." That kind of startled me because she was unconscious the night before. So I said something like, "Gee, I'm surprised. I thought you were, out cold." And she said, "Not in my room. I saw you talking to my roommate down the hall."
Oh,
that just,
chills.
I couldn't imagine what she was talking about. The only way that could have happened is she left her body and followed me down the hall. And as far as I could tell, you are your body. How can that happen? She saw how confused I was. So she started to tell me about our conversation with the roommate, where we were sitting, what the room looked like, what we were wearing, all the details, completely accurate.
Oh my goodness.
I didn't know what to make of this. I was just stunned. I was actually pretty frightened by it. So I realized.
Would you say this was your first week on the job?
Yes. No, I was a new doctor.
Bless you.
Desperately trying to look professional. I was totally discombobulated. So I realized.
All I can say is I'm so glad we started this whole interview with this story. It's just fabulous.
Well, I didn't know what to do, but I realized I can't deal with my confusion. I have to deal with, my job is to deal with her confusion. So I brought it back to her. I talked to her about why she tried to overdose and so forth, and arranged for her to be admitted to the psychiatric unit. And then tried to put it out of my mind. I tried to think about it. Couldn't make any sense out of it. I thought, someone's playing a trick on me. This can't be real. Maybe the nurses, maybe a roommate, somebody's playing a trick. I couldn't figure out how it happened. I just sort of put it out of my mind. And then in the next couple of years, I heard a couple of more stories from my patients who had similar stories to tell about leaving their bodies when they were near death and seeing and hearing things they shouldn't have been able to. And I thought, well, they're psychiatric patients. Maybe they're just crazy. Who knows? And about 5 years later, one of my colleagues at the University of Virginia, Raymond Moody, published a book called Life After Life, in which he gave us the term near-death experiences and told us what they were like. And I realized for the first time, this isn't just a couple of crazy patients. This is something that's happening to normal people all over the world. I couldn't make any sense out of it, but I'm a scientist, so I figured I need to study this. Now, a true scientist doesn't run away from things he can't understand. He goes towards them and tries to figure them out. So I started collecting cases. and trying to understand what's going on when they have this experience and how can we make sense of it. And now, half a century later, I'm still trying to understand it.
Wow. Oh my goodness. What a fabulous story. It feels just so, when I hear things like this, I just think, it feels so much these things are destined, like for that to happen so early on in your career, to that
Yes.
just completely then took you in that direction.
Yeah.
Amazing. And again, real testament to you that that's what you're, as you said, a real scientist that goes towards something rather than runs away from it. I love that so much. Wow. So I kind of feel like where to start. I guess what I'd like to know, I guess almost to sort of like lay some, I guess, sort of foundations to have the conversation on. Did you start to see any commonalities as you were studying these cases? Did you see commonalities in terms of like, was there a particular reason you started to see show up in terms of, if not types of people, points in their life or something like that would suggest people are more likely to have near-death experiences? Did you see any correlations like that?
I did not. They happen to people of any gender, any race, any ethnicity. Doesn't matter how they came close to death. They all had the same basic phenomena. We looked at things like, what were their religious beliefs beforehand? What were their cultural background like? And that didn't seem to be correlated at all with whether they have an experience or what type they have.
Wow.
But consistently, people have the same stories to tell us about their thoughts being clearer and faster than ever before, while their brains were apparently not working, having powerful emotions, feeling overwhelming peace and well-being, having what we call paranormal experiences, for lack of any better words, a sense of leaving the body, having extrasensory perception, and in some cases, seeming to leave the physical world and go to some other realm or dimension where they may see other entities that they recognize as deceased loved ones, or which they label as deities. And at some point they decide to come back or are sent back against their will sometimes.
Wow. Yeah. Which, it's so interesting how, again, I mentioned this to you before we started recording, but at this point we've recorded topics on all kinds of things, often things that are really dismissed as nonsense by mainstream. The interesting thing is, so many of the people that I interview on these supposed nonsense topics are scientists. I just keep marveling at the way that we've got all of this evidence now to suggest these things are happening, and yet they've not been accepted as real at a kind of like mainstream level. It's still seen as quite fringe. I'd love to know, before we start to dive more into I guess what those experiences are and what they might tell us, I'd love to know your thoughts in terms of how far have we come in the research that you and I guess other people that are in your line of work that do. How close are we getting to that having some kind of more, I don't know if quite the word is mainstream, but like I can't think of the word, but like acceptance in a way where it's not just seen as something that only exists on the fringe?
Yeah, well, we have come a long way, but we still have a long way to go. But I've seen a great difference in the way my colleagues accept this phenomenon over the last several decades. I have the advantage of working in a medical setting, which is different from a basic science area where people are so locked into a materialistic mindset that that's all they can see. And they may not accept anything that doesn't fit into their worldview. But doctors and nurses in medical settings are concerned with helping their patients. So whether they can understand something or not, if it helps them treat their patients, they want to know about it. So I've seen doctors and nurses saying, well, I don't understand this, but I see that my patients are having it and it affects their attitudes and beliefs, so I need to know about it. So, when we would talk about this in medical conferences back in 1980, we'd get polite silence from the audience. And, I just gave a talk at the American Psychiatric Association last month. And when I finished, doctor stood up in the audience and said, let me tell you about my near-death experience. So it's very common now. People accept it. They still have a lot of questions about what causes it, what it means, but they accept that these are real experiences that happen to many, many patients and have profound effects on them.
Oh, wow. I love that so much. So something I've, in the reading I've done on near-death experiences and then the kind of sort of counter arguments, from what I've seen, one of them is this sense of it's, although people are having these, you know, supposedly like mystical experiences, it's really just a function of, I'm going to use really clumsy non-scientific terms here.
Yeah.
It's just a function of parts of the brain kind of like closing down, and therefore kind of restrictions on, you know, our experience of self, where normally we're kind of contained in this sense. We then don't have the same sense of like being within the parameters of the body, but it's not because there is kind of anything paranormal happening. It's purely a kind of function of the brain. I suspect probably far better articulated than I've just done. I suspect you're very familiar with those kinds of arguments. I'd love to know what have you seen that would suggest that isn't what's going on,
Well,
or isn't all that's going on?
Yeah, I don't think it's just something in the brain or just something paranormal. I think it's both. And you know, we usually are taught that the mind is what the brain does, that all our thoughts and feelings are created by the brain. And the reason we think that is that when your brain is injured, you don't think very clearly. You know, when you get intoxicated or you have a stroke or get hit on the head, that affects your thinking. So we assume that means the brain is causing or creating your thoughts. But that's not the only interpretation of that correlation. Let me give you an example of a television set. There are hundreds of television programs being broadcast to you all the time. And if you tried to watch them all, you wouldn't be able to understand them because you're seeing them all simultaneously. So we have a television set which receives the shows from outside and filters out all those except the one you want to watch. And it translates those into visions and sounds so you can hear them. So we see that the television seems to be creating the TV show. And if the TV set is broken, you don't see the show. But we know that the show is not created inside the TV set. It's created somewhere else, and the TV set just interprets it for us, filters it for us. And I think the brain can function in the same way.
Oh, yes, love that.
That our thoughts are out there somewhere in our mind, and the brain receives them, filters out the irrelevant stuff like seeing deceased loved ones and seeing God and so forth, and just lets in the things that are important to the brain, which means how do we survive in the physical world? What will help us find food and shelter and a mate and avoid predators? That's all the brain wants to do, keep us focused on that. So when you have something like a near-death experience and the brain starts shutting down, what gets shut down is the filtering out of all the quote irrelevant stuff. And then you can perceive these other entities, these other realms that you normally get filtered out and don't see them.
I love that. So that's such a great explanation. Yeah, wow, that makes so much sense to me. And so do you have I guess particular examples you can share that would show that's what's happening, and not just that the brain's kind of creating that as a phenomena, but that's not what's happening?
Well, if it was just the brain creating illusions or hallucinations, then people wouldn't be able to see things accurately from an out-of-body perspective. And let me give you an example of one of these. A fellow I knew, he was in his mid-50s. He was a delivery driver. And when he was on his rounds one day, he started having terrible crushing chest pains. So he managed to get himself to a hospital. And in the emergency room, they did some evaluation and found that he had 4 vessels to his heart completely blocked. So they rushed him to the operating room for an emergency quadruple bypass surgery. He later told me that in the middle of the operation, he rose up above his body and looked down and watched what was going on. And to his great surprise, he saw his surgeon flapping his arms like he was trying to fly. And he wiggled his arms to illustrate that for me. Now, at that point, I had been a doctor for about 30 years. I started laughing. I couldn't imagine this really happening. So I said to him, maybe you were hallucinating because you were anesthetized and that was affecting your brain. He said, no, you talk to my doctor. He'll tell you you did this. So with his permission, I talked to his doctor. And the surgeon who did this procedure said, well, yes, I did do that. I let my assistant start the procedure and I put on my sterile gown and gloves and then walk into the operating room and watch them and supervise them. And while they're doing that, I don't want to risk touching anything that's not sterile. So I put my hands where I know they won't touch anything, flat on my chest. And I point things out to them using my elbows so I don't touch anything. And he wiggled his elbows just like the patient did. I've never seen any other doctor do this. You don't see doctors on television doing this type of thing. And yet the patient saw it.
Wow.
So we've got many cases of this. One of my colleagues.
If that's a coincidence, it's a pretty far-fetched coincidence.
Well, and of course, skeptics will say, yes, it's a coincidence. It's a lucky guess. It's a rare occasion. But one of my colleagues, Jan Holden at the University of North Texas, studied about 100 of these cases of people who claim to leave their bodies and see things. And she found that in 92% of them, what they said happened was confirmed by a third witness, a party who was in, like a surgeon in the operating room confirmed it. So in almost every case, they were completely accurate. And that should not happen if it's just a hallucination.
Yeah, wow. And it can't be explained also where, I don't know, they are still able to hear and process, but not, if because these are things they're also visual and you'd know if a patient had their eyes open.
Right.
Yeah. Wow. How common is it for patients to have that kind of near-death experience where they are able to witness things that they shouldn't have been able to?
Well, let me say first that near-death experiences occur in about 10 to 20% of people whose hearts stop. So it doesn't happen to everybody.
Yeah, but fairly quite, a sizable number.
Yeah. And of those who have a near-death experience, about a third of them will report leaving their bodies and seeing things that can be corroborated by other people. So it's a lot of people.
It really is. That's really surprised me.
Yeah.
I think it's a sense of kind of almost, I'm sure you've felt this so many times, almost like frustration with like this degree, this quantity and this degree of evidence. It's baffling me that it takes so long for these things to be accepted. But like you say, it's definitely changing. It's definitely changing.
Yes. Well, scientists generally want to understand how it happens. What lets the whatever you are leave your body, and how does whatever this is you are then connect with the brain and talk to it. And we don't have an answer for that yet.
No, unfortunately, that's how it takes us into the sticky problem of consciousness. So, no, that makes sense. It's like, without knowing the how, it's really hard then to accept it. But it's probably going to be some time before we do understand the how.
Yes.
So what have you seen to be actually, before I ask you this question, is there the sense in some of them, or maybe many of the patients that have had this experience, that they come back with a sense of knowing why they had it?
I'm not sure they know why they had it. Many of them feel like it was a gift given to them, or that they were somehow off track in their lives and this is a chance to do it again. But they generally feel like they've been sort of blessed by having this experience and are glad to have it when they come back. Now, as a psychiatrist, what interests me most about these experiences is how this changes people's lives.
Yes, that was the question I was going to ask you next. And I just wondered if they almost had a kind of sense of that even before they really started to see that play out into their lives. But carry on, because I was about to ask you that question.
Almost all of them have profound changes in attitudes. And the most common thing we hear is that they're no longer afraid of death and dying.
Yeah.
And, fear of death is so pervasive in our culture and it affects so much of what we do. And to have them come back and say, I'm not afraid of death anymore. They also have, along with that, an increased joy in life. It's as if when you lose your fear of dying, you lose your fear of living. And you tend to jump in with both feet and live in the now and really enjoy life to the fullest because you're not afraid of dying. So why not take a risk?
Yeah.
Now, I will say that almost anybody who comes close to death will value their life more. But if you haven't had a near-death experience, that tends to make you more careful, more cautious, more restricted because you're afraid of dying. But if you have a near-death experience, it expands your life, enriches it. It makes you feel much more connected to the universe and safe. Along with this often goes an increase in spirituality. And when people say that, they say, I don't mean more religious, I mean more spiritual. And what they mean by that is more connected to other people, to the natural world, to the divine. And that gives them a sense of compassion for other people as well. They tend to say, the religion that I was brought up in kind of hinted at the truth, but it's just a distorted portion of it. And I feel equally at home in any house of worship or even just out in nature. And I've also seen this from people who were atheists before the near-death experience. And they come back saying, I don't understand it, but now I know there is a God and that's, I am part of it. And that's,
Oh,
and
I
should
love
say
that.
that along with this increase in spirituality is a decrease in concern for worldly matters. And that includes not only material possessions, but also power, prestige, fame, competition. These things no longer have any meaning for near-death experiences.
That really makes sense. I mentioned before we started recording that I've got a particular interest in this topic, even though it's not, even though I've not experienced one. It feels very related to what you were saying there about death. And I guess my start on this path of kind of, I guess you could say, spirituality, came about with the sudden death of my father, which was 10 years ago this year. And he died very suddenly in a road traffic accident. And the day he died, we had a very, very strong bond. He brought me up as a single father, so we had an exceptionally strong bond. And the day he died, the experience I had was I'd kind of almost as if I'd had a near-death experience. It was like I had this kind of almost like just being blown open to the sense that there wasn't just this material realm. It was like I was starting to almost experience his experience in a way, is probably the best I can describe it. And then about a week after he died, so I was having all these sort of strange experiences where I was like, this is not how I was expecting to feel when I've just lost my dad unexpectedly. And then about a week after he died, a friend of his recommended, you may have heard of the book Journey of Souls by Michael Newton.
Yes, yes.
And I read that, and it was just started to kind of like give me some sort of like more tangible understanding of the things that I was starting to have an experiential understanding of.
Yes, yes.
And I then went on to have a kind of like a past life regression with one of his sort of practitioners. And I haven't really felt the need to then sort of continue in that like vein of research, but it really was what led me to do all the work I do now. And as you can probably hear, it has a really strong link to everything you're describing, even though I didn't need to have the near-death experience myself. It was like I somehow experienced it in a different way. But it certainly gave me that a completely different relationship to death. And even though I hadn't had that experience of near-death experience, losing my dad and then realizing it hasn't had the negative effect on me it's had, but it's also done something different. It's given me this opening to understand there is something beyond death. And then my whole life changed. Like, I left my job, I started on the path I'm on now. So it was like I had like what you're describing is that happened to me. So I just wanted to share that because everything you're saying, it is giving me almost like another level of understanding of what happened to me and why it happened.
Yes, yes. Well, a near-death experience is just one of the most common ways today to get this type of spiritual experience. But there are many ways of doing that. And most of our religious and spiritual traditions have developed technologies over the centuries to help you do that, whether it's meditation or using psychedelic drugs or drumming dancing, so forth, or sensory deprivation, sometimes going out into the desert on a mission quest. But we develop ways of getting beyond the limits of the physical body and realizing there's a lot more to myself than just that. And, one of the differences with near-death experiences and with your experience is that you weren't prepared for it. People who go through some spiritual tradition are guided by it and they're training for it, they're trying to get it. But with near-death experiences and with your experience, it came unexpected and you were totally unprepared for it. And that maybe has more of an impact than if you had been trying to get it.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And it's interesting what you said about people who have had those near-death experiences see it as a blessing or a gift.
Yes.
It feels strange to say this because, clearly I'd much rather my father still be around, but the way I experienced his death very much felt like a blessing.
Yes.
It really was. And I think because it was so unexpected, it really, it was like a just overnight transformation. And again, I guess that's why maybe I asked you, did the people who've had these near-death experiences kind of come back with a sense of almost like this was meant to happen for me? It probably took me time to kind of feel that way about how I experienced it, but over time I've really seen like I see it really as a soul contract between me and my father, like that was how it was meant to happen.
Right. Well, people usually come back from a near-death experience saying that this was designed for me, it's personal for me, and I was sent back here to try to do things right. And they come back with this idea that we're all connected with this, and that makes them much more compassionate, much more altruistic in their behavior. And that drastically changes their lives based on what they were like before. If they were very spiritual before, it may not change them very much. But if they were in a very competitive business, they come back saying, this doesn't make sense anymore, getting ahead at someone else's expense, because we're all part of the same thing. And they either change how they work or get out of the profession. And they often go into some helping profession, healthcare, teaching, social work, clergy, something like that. It's even more pronounced in people who have violent professions. For example, career police officers or military officers who have a near-death experience and then can't even think about shooting somebody, even in self-defense. That's just unthinkable for them. And that can wreak havoc in their lives and in their families as well.
Yes. Yeah. It certainly did in mine, and I wasn't in a violent profession.
Right. Yeah.
Now I can imagine.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
It changes what you think is important in life to do.
Yes, completely. Yeah. Wow. I feel like I want to ask you so many different questions. I'm struggling to choose. What's how for you doing this work? What's this provided to you personally?
Well, I can't say that I was afraid of death before I started this, because I don't think I was. I thought death was nothing. You live your life, you die, and that's the end of it. And that's nothing to be afraid of. You're not there anymore. And now I can't believe it anymore. I've seen so much evidence that we persist after death. And let me give you an example about this. Many people in a near-death experience say they encountered deceased loved ones. And that's easy to dismiss as wishful thinking or expectations. I'm going to die. I want to see my father, so I imagined him. But there are a number of cases where people see in a near-death experience someone who is dead, but who is not yet known to be dead. So you don't have any expectation. And I'll give you an example of one fellow I knew. He was from South Africa, about 25 years old. He was a technical writer. He was hospitalized with severe pneumonia, and he kept having respiratory arrest where he couldn't breathe at all. So he was hospitalized for a few weeks. And his primary nurse, who worked with him every day, was about 21. And they got very close. And at one point she said, I'm going to be taking a few days off, so there'll be other nurses substituting for me. So she went away. And while she was gone, he had another respiratory arrest and had to be resuscitated and had a near-death experience. And he found himself in a beautiful pastoral scene. And then to his surprise, this nurse, Anita, comes walking towards him. And he did a double take and said, Anita, what are you doing here? And she said, you can't stay here, Jack. You need to go back to your body. And I want you to find my parents. and tell them that I love them very much and I'm sorry they wrecked the red MGB. And then she turned and walked away. When he later woke up in this hospital room, he had total memory of this bizarre experience. And he tried to tell it to the first nurse who walked into his room, and she got very upset and ran out. It turned out that his nurse, his primary nurse, had taken the weekend off to celebrate her 21st birthday. And her parents surprised her with the gift of a red MGB. She got excited, jumped in the car, took off for a drive, crashed into a telephone pole, and died instantly a few hours before he had his near-death experience. There's no way he could have expected her to die, or no way he could have known how she died, and yet he did. And
I'm just covered in
yeah. What do you do with this? I mean, and this is not a new thing. Pliny the Elder, the Roman historian, wrote about a case like this in the 1st century. So these go back, centuries. And we have very well documented cases now where people encountered deceased individuals that no one yet knew had died. And I don't know how to explain that in terms of the brain creating all our thoughts.
No.
Clearly, after this woman died, something about her was still able to survive and communicate. So how do you listen to these stories and not be affected by it?
Yeah. Wow. It does feel such an important message. It really does. So important. So for people listening, what would you say is, I mean, there's so much to be seen in everything you've said that feels, for me, and again, because I've kind of had an experience in a different way of so much what you're talking about, for me, it's almost just like further confirmation of that. But for someone who's listening to this and perhaps either hasn't really known much about what we can learn from near-death experiences, or perhaps have just been really skeptical about it, what would you say?
Well, there are a number of things. One is just to be aware of how common these things are. About 5% of the general population have had a near-death experience, 1 out of every 20 people. So someone in your workplace, in your classroom, in your extended family has probably had a near-death experience. And they're also not in any way connected to mental illness. As a psychiatrist, I started thinking about that. So we did studies looking at how common are near-death experiences among the mentally ill, and how common is near-death or mental illness among people who have near-death experiences. And there's absolutely no association between the two. It's also important to realize that these experiences have profound after effects on people's lives, on their attitudes, on their behaviors, on their lifestyles. And although they sound like they're good changes, they also create havoc in the patient's lives sometimes and need to be addressed. They also strongly suggest that our minds are not our brains. There's something separate. And that really has profound effects on how we think about who we are and what we are. And if the mind can function when the brain is shutting down, that opens the possibility that it can still function after the brain has stopped. And we've seen lots of evidence that people whose bodies have died are still functioning in some way. But the most important thing I think people get from a near-death experience is a sense that we are all interconnected. People come back saying that I know now that the golden rule, do unto others as you have them do unto you, which is part of every religion we have, is not just a guideline we're supposed to follow. This is a law of the universe. This is what happens. When you hurt other people, you hurt yourself. And when you help other people, you're helping yourself as well. Let me give you a graphic example of this. Tom was a 35-year-old fellow who was working under his truck in his driveway one day. He had the truck jacked up and he was underneath it, and it crashed and crushed his chest. And he had a very elaborate near-death experience. And one part of it was a life review. He went through everything that ever happened in his life. He relived it, not just saw it, but relived it in minute detail, not only from his eyes, but through the eyes of other people as well. For example, he remembered being a teenager and driving his truck down the street, and an intoxicated man walked out in front of his truck and he almost hit him. He was furious, hot-headed teenager. So he stopped the car, rolled down the window, and started yelling at the man. And the man, unfortunately being intoxicated, reached his hand in the window and slapped Tom across the face. That was too much for this hot-headed teenager. So he gets out of the truck and starts beating the man up and left him a bloody mess in the road, and then got back in his truck and drove off. Well, when he had his near-death experience, he relived this not only through his own eyes, feeling the adrenaline rush and the rage, but also through the eyes of the man he beat up. The intoxication, the humiliation of being beaten by this teenager, his nose getting bloody, his teeth going through his lower lip, and he felt every one of Tom's 35 blows against his face. Now, Tom couldn't have told you it was 35, but reliving it through the eyes of that man, he counted them, he knew it. And he came back saying, I realized that that guy and me, we're the same thing. There's no distinction here. So when I was hurting him, I was really hurting myself. And that totally transformed his life.
Goodness me. Wow. This is probably now going beyond the what you can sort of strictly know through kind of,
Yes.
but
Yes.
I'm guessing you've had a lot of time to really try to make sense of some of these things.
Right.
How do you personally, I guess, hold this? Do you see it as kind of thinking about it, for example, in Michael Newton's work, where I guess in simple terms would describe it as kind of, we do have like some sense of separate consciousness that you could call, say, individual souls within
Right.
soul family kind of groups, but then within that we're all interconnected.
Right.
How would you describe it, what you've kind of been able to make sense of? Would you describe it something akin to that or something different?
Yes, I would. Let me tell you what the near-death experiences tell me. Some say it's like looking at your hand. If you look at the fingers, there are 5 separate entities. But if you look at the whole hand, you see they're all connected at the bottom in the palm. And that's the way we are. We're all part of the same thing, although we have some differences. Others will say it's like being a wave in the ocean. The wave is made of the same material the rest of the ocean is, but it has a separate structure and shape and size and so forth temporarily, because we know after a while the wave will fade back into the ocean and you're part of the whole thing again. And that's the way they talk about their relationship to other people, to the universe, to the divine. We're all part of the same thing. We're temporarily isolated as a separate individual, but that's only temporary. And we know there's more to it than that.
Wow. Do you get I love how you talk about the ways you talk about these things in the metaphors. They really do illuminate so clearly. When you say that sort of temporary nature of things, do you have a sense of how temporary do you think that is? Is it kind of, one life's worth? Is it many lives worth before you go back into the whole?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm a scientist, I'm not a philosopher. But the way near-death experiences talk about being beyond the body, they're part of some universal Godhead or something, some universal consciousness, and yet they still retain something of their individual identity. And it seems like a paradox, but many things that they talk about, they will say, I can't really explain it to you in words. It doesn't go into words. I can't explain it. And we say, great, tell me about it, So we force them to use metaphors to describe what happens. For example, many people will see a warm, loving being of light and feel welcomed and protected by it. And when they tell me that, they'll say, I'm going to call this God, so you know roughly what I'm talking about. But this is not the God I was taught about in church. It's much bigger than that. But I don't know what else to call it, so I'll call it God. And people from different cultures will give it different names, but they all describe the same feeling of being warmed and loved and protected and accepted by this, whatever it is.
Yeah, that's why you got such good metaphors, because you're used to hearing so many.
I get them from them, yes.
That really makes sense. And do you have a sense from what people who've had near-death experiences tell you, the kind of purpose of us being here as humans?
Well, that's a good question. And I asked them about this because if things are so great in this other realm, why do we come back to this horrible physical world where so much problems, And they usually say something like, we came back here to learn something. And it usually comes down to learning how to love. In that other realm, love is all around. You're part of it all. And it's very easy. It's natural. But to come to this world and feel that same and express that same unconditional love is very difficult because people are nasty here. They're not, there are all sorts of problems here that make it hard to love. And you can't learn how to do that in a world where love is all around. Yes. So we come here really, our task here is to learn how to love in spite of all the problems here.
That does then beg the question, if love is all around when you are not in the physical realm, why would you need to learn to love?
I can't answer that.
No, I had a feeling you wouldn't. What's your sense of that though? Because it is kind of paradoxical, isn't it? Like, why would you need to learn something that you could effortlessly do when you're not here?
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. But that seems to be part of our journey, is to try to learn how to be better in some way.
Oh my goodness, I'm so enjoying this conversation. I really am. So I have no idea. I suspect the time's been flying. Yes, so we're almost out of time. What would you feel is something to share that we haven't touched on yet, that for you has been kind of one of the, I guess, most helpful or surprising aspects of the work you've done?
Yeah. Well, it's all been surprising. There's no part that hasn't been. I wasn't expecting any of this.
It's hardly the expected, is it?
But the way it's changed me most is made me more comfortable with the uncertainty of life. I went into this field as a scientist thinking we're going to have all the answers, just ask the right questions, you do the research, you get the answers. And now I'm pretty well convinced that we're not going to, because our brains can't understand it. Near-death experience will say that. When I was in the other realm, I had access to all the information there is. And now that I'm back in my body, I can't understand any of it.
Yeah.
So
even someone who's had the experience.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I know it was there, but I can't recapture it. So I think, that number one, living in our brains as we do everyday life, we just can't understand what's really going on here. And number two,
and we're not meant to. We're not meant to.
Yes, we don't need to. We don't need to.
Yeah.
I believe from what they tell me that the universe is a friendly place and that we belong here and that there's nothing to be afraid of. So if we don't understand, that's okay. Just go with it.
What was just occurring to me as you were saying that, it feels to me there's a kind of nuance that perhaps we've really lost contact with in our modern culture, where we've become so closed to being able to experience this kind of interconnectedness of everything, that the conditioning we've received has created much more of a closure to it. And so that for me doesn't necessarily feel natural. Let's say it's hard to ever say these things because, hey, it's where we are, but that degree of not being able to understand it, I think it is probably the cause of so many of what we're currently seeing as problems in our world. And if we look at like my own kind of path is in shamanism, where this way of understanding the world, like an animistic perspective, is the norm, as we see in pretty much every indigenous culture we've understood. And it seems to me that it's far more natural for humans to have some degree of understanding of that interconnectedness, but not to the level where that's fully how we're, it's kind of like an opening, but not a full opening. Like we are meant to have a sense of like, here I am on this current, realm being a human, and I have a sense of that interconnectedness. That feels to me much more of the kind of sweet spot for humanity.
Right. I think you're right. When you think about an infant who is totally bonded with the mother, it's like there's no distinction there between the infant and the mother, and they're just totally merged with it. And it feels blissful. And then as we age and get older and go to school and get indoctrinated, we realize, oh no, I'm a separate entity. I'm not, that's different. I'm different. And it becomes so important to us, especially in our Western culture,
Yes.
to be in control of our lives and to define who we are. I'm a certain age, I'm a certain gender, I'm a certain nationality, and to separate yourself from other people. And in a near-death experience, people find themselves not in control of anything and not having a gender, an ethnicity, an age, and so forth. And they feel better than ever. They don't need those things. And when they come back, what they retain when they come back is this sense that I don't need that stuff. I am who I am, regardless of my gender, my age, my rationality, my nationality. And it's fine not being in control because we're part of the same thing. And that I don't need to be competitive. I don't need to be fighting other people. I don't need to be collecting material goods. That's not important. What's important is actualizing the connection with other people, about living the golden rule, about helping other people, about being bonded with others.
Yeah. This has been such a delightful conversation. It's one of those, it's one of the episodes where I feel like I've changed during the course of this conversation. There's something in what you're talking about, the way you're talking about it. I can kind of feel myself kind of opening further into experiences again that were present for me, but I can feel there's a deepening happen just listening to you. Yeah, such incredible work you're doing. So unfortunately, we are coming up on time. What would you suggest to listeners? So I'm hoping that our listeners by now, at least if they haven't got a kind of like absolutely, that all makes sense to me, that's definitely what's happening, they may at least have an opening to the things you're talking about. What would you suggest to them as they don't necessarily have to be like practical next steps, but like next steps they could take having listened to this?
Yeah, well, I've recently written a book called After. A doctor explores what near-death experiences reveal about life and beyond. And I talk about most of the things we've talked about today, but I also go into the research that shows that you don't have to have a near-death experience to absorb some of these insights. And just learning about near-death experiences can change you and can open you up to the spiritual world. And there's been a lot of research done with college students, high school students, nursing students who've been taught about near-death experiences and then have profound attitude and behavioral changes. And that's partly why I wrote this book, to spread the word and let people know this is out there for you. So if people would like to read that book or go to my website, which is www.brucegreyson.com, I don't have to tell your audience that Greyson's with an E because I have to tell Americans that.
Yes, yeah, we spell it the right way anyway.
Yes, you do. You do. But it just remain open to other possibilities because they are out there, and they often maybe make your life more fulfilling and more enriching to absorb them.
I love that. It feels there's something so profound in, as you say, not just having a near-death experience, but the ripple effect of them onto other people's lives. Again, I could feel that just happening as speaking to you, even though you've not had a near-death experience, you speaking about near-death experience, I can feel that having that effect on me. So what you just said there really doesn't surprise me. There is something just so gorgeous about, as you're saying, as medical professionals are learning about near-death experiences, it has a positive impact on them. There's something just so beautiful about that, isn't there?
Right, and it makes doctors and nurses more open to listening to their patients and valuing their experiences.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I'm so glad you're doing the work you're doing. It's so needed and so powerful. So yeah, I've got so much gratitude for you just doing what you're doing, and then for coming and sharing that with us.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Lian. I'm very glad that you're doing this work you're doing as well, spreading the word to the universe, really.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we both ended up on the path we were meant to end up on. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lian.